The call came from a neighbor, a man named Cliff Akers, who farmed the 90 acres directly to the south and who had no reason to involve himself in anyone else's business, and who called anyway because he thought Harlan ought to know. He said, "Some men came out this morning with a survey rig, didn't knock on your door, just set up at the south fence line and started working. I watched them for about an hour, then I came inside and called you." Harlan Goss said, "What company?" Cliff said he didn't catch the name. He said the truck was white. He said one of the men had a clipboard and the other ran the equipment, and neither of them spoke to him when he walked over. He said the one with the clipboard looked at Harlan's fence line and then looked at his own paperwork, and then said something to the other man that made them both laugh. Harlan said, "All right, Cliff, thank you." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse he had built in 1979, and he looked out the window toward the south field. He could not see the fence line from here. The land curved away from the house in a long, gentle slope, 400 acres of it, and whatever was happening at the southern edge was beyond his sight. He was 77 years old. He had owned this land for 46 years. He had survived 2 droughts, a bankruptcy scare in 1987 that he had resolved by selling his truck and his tractor and leasing them back from the buyer, and one February that he did not discuss with anyone. He had survived all of it. He put on his boots. He drove the farm road south. The land gives back exactly what you put into it. Harlan Goss believed that before he could have put it into words, the way a person believes something they learned from watching rather than being told. He had watched his father put everything into rented land for 40 years and get nothing permanent in return. His father worked hard and honestly for 4 decades and died in a rented house on somebody else's ground, and the landlord had raised the rent the following spring. Harlan was 19 when his father died. He was already gone by then, enlisted at 18, shipped to Vietnam at 19, assigned to the 101st Airborne and sent into country in the late summer of 1966. He came back quieter than he left. He came back with a limp that faded over years and a way of sitting very still in loud rooms that never did. He came back knowing exactly one thing. He was going to own land before he was 35, and no one was ever going to be able to raise the rent on him. He worked construction for 7 years. He framed houses in Grayson County, Kentucky, and poured concrete in 3 neighboring counties, and saved with the discipline of someone who has decided saving is not optional. He lived with his sister for 2 years. He drove a truck with no heat for 3 winters. In 1976, a farmer named Ed Caudill listed 400 acres in Grayson County for sale at $148,000. Harlan had $91,000. He went to a bank in Leachfield, and they gave him a loan for $60,000, and he signed the papers on a Friday afternoon and drove out to the land before the title company had even filed the deed. He walked it that first evening until it was too dark to see. He found the corner markers, 4 iron pins, one at each corner of the property, set by the original survey from 1951. He noted where each one was. He remembered the locations the way a person memorizes something they understand they will need. He built the farmhouse in 1979, framed it himself with Cliff Akers and 2 other neighbors who arrived the first morning without being asked. He grew hay and kept cattle. He paid the loan off in 1993, 3 years early. He married a woman named Ruth in 1981. She was from a farming family herself, and she knew what the land required, and she gave it without complaint. She kept a garden along the south side of the house, and she baked on Saturdays, and she kept a notebook. A green-covered spiral notebook she bought at the hardware store in Leachfield, where she wrote down everything that happened on the farm that she thought someone ought to remember. Offers on the land when they came, conversations with neighbors about boundary lines, names, dates, amounts. She had been keeping the notebook since 1983. By the time she died in the winter of 2019, there were 11 of them, each labeled by year range on the spine in her handwriting. Harlan kept them in the drawer of the desk in the spare bedroom. He had not read them since she died. He had not been able to. The company that sent the survey crew was called Consolidated Land Systems, LLC. It was incorporated in Delaware. Its registered agent was a firm in Lexington that served as registered agent for 340 other LLCs. Its website listed no employees and no physical office address. It had been formed 14 months earlier. A letter arrived 8 days after Cliff Akers called. It stated that Consolidated had acquired, through a portfolio purchase from a dissolved agricultural cooperative, a recorded boundary agreement from 1967, establishing the southern boundary of the Goss property at a point 380 feet north of where the current fence line stood. It stated that the 380-foot strip, approximately 23 acres, between the recorded boundary and the current fence line had never legally belonged to Harlan Goss, and that Consolidated was asserting ownership of that strip and demanding he vacate the fencing within 45 days or face legal action. Then the representative arrived. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 36 years old. He drove a black SUV. He wore a suit that was too heavy for the Kentucky spring, and he carried a briefcase that he set on Harlan's kitchen table without being invited to do so. He had printouts, the 1967 boundary agreement, the cooperative's original filing, the chain of title showing the transfer to Consolidated. He was polite in the way people are polite when they have already decided the outcome. He said Consolidated was prepared to offer Harlan a settlement of $14,000 for the 23 acres, which he described as a fair acknowledgement of Harlan's improvements on the strip over the years. Harlan looked at the printouts. He looked at the 1967 document. Then he said, "That boundary line is wrong." Marcus Webb said, "The boundary line is recorded." Harlan said, "I know where my pins are." Webb said he understood, and that this was a common reaction, and that the recorded instrument was the controlling document, not the physical markers. He said it gently, the way someone explains something to a person they do not expect to understand it fully. Harlan said he would need time to look into it. Webb said he understood. He left his card. He picked up his briefcase and walked to his SUV. He called someone on his phone before he had reached the end of the driveway. Harlan watched from the window. 3 days later, Harlan drove into Leachfield and went to the office of a lawyer named Howard Birch. Howard was 64 years old and had practiced property law in Grayson County for 36 years. He read the letter. He read the 1967 boundary agreement. He said he wanted to order an independent survey before he said anything definitive. He said, "But I want you to find your corner pins before the surveyor gets here. All 4 of them. Can you do that?" Harlan said, "I can do that today." He found all 4 pins that afternoon. They were exactly where he remembered them. He marked each one with an orange flag on a wire stake. He texted photographs to Howard Birch, who called back within an hour and said, "Good. Now go home and think about whether your wife ever wrote anything down about that south boundary line." Harlan sat with that for a moment. Then he went to the spare bedroom. He opened the drawer. He took out the notebooks. Ruth had started noting boundary conversations in the 3rd notebook, which covered 1989 through 1994. In the entry for April 1991, she had written, "Man from the co-op came by asking about the south line again. H showed him the pins. Man said the recorded line was different. H told him the pins were set in 1951 and predated the 1967 agreement, and that the agreement had been filed in error. The co-op surveyor had used the wrong baseline. Man left, said he'd be back. Never came back." In the 5th notebook, covering 1998 through 2004, she had written, "Someone from First Agricultural called about the south acreage, asked if we'd sell. Said they had a buyer interested in the strip between our fence and what they called the recorded line. We said no. H asked where they got the recorded line figure. They said from the co-op filing. H explained again about the baseline error. They did not seem interested. H says someday someone is going to try to use that filing. I wrote this down in case." Harlan read that sentence 3 times. "I wrote this down in case." He called Howard Birch at 7:30 in the morning. He read the entries over the phone. Howard was quiet. Then he said, "How many entries are there?" There were 7 entries across 4 notebooks, spanning from 1989 to 2011. Every time the south boundary had come up, with the co-op, with a bank representative, with a developer who'd knocked on the door in 2006. Ruth had written it down. The date, the name if she had it, what was said, what Harlan had told them. The same explanation repeated across 22 years. The 1967 agreement used the wrong baseline. The pins from 1951 were controlling. The fence was right. Howard said, "This is a record of a pattern. They've been trying to establish a claim on this strip for over 2 decades, and your wife documented every attempt." He said, "I need originals of those notebooks. Don't let them out of your sight until we meet." The state survey was conducted 3 weeks later by an examiner from the Kentucky Office of Land Surveying. Her name was Carol Finch. She spent 2 full days on the property. She located all 4 corner pins, the pins on Cliff Acres' southern boundary and the pins on the property to the east. She pulled the original 1951 survey from the Grayson County land records. She pulled the 1967 boundary agreement. She ran her measurements. She called Howard Birch on the 3rd day. The call lasted 19 minutes. Howard said almost nothing during it. He listened. When she had finished, he asked one question. He said, "In your professional opinion, is the 1967 boundary agreement's baseline error recoverable? Meaning, could it be corrected in a way that would move the boundary north?" She said, "No." The 1951 survey used the federal section corner as its reference point. That is the controlling datum. The 1967 agreement used a temporary benchmark that no longer exists and cannot be reconstructed. The fence line is correct. The recorded line in the 1967 agreement is the error. The 400 acres belong to Harlan Goss exactly as the fence describes them. She filed her findings with the Kentucky Office of Land Surveying as a formal contested survey opinion. The document was 14 pages. The conclusion was 1 sentence. Marcus Webb called 2 days after the filing became public record. He said Consolidated was prepared to revisit the settlement offer. Howard Birch told him the matter had been referred to federal court and that all communications should go through him. The hearing was held in the Western District of Kentucky Federal Court in Bowling Green on a Thursday in March. The courtroom was on the 3rd floor. Pale wood walls, the kind that had been there long enough to look like they belonged. An American flag in the far corner. The air was cool and still. Consolidated's legal team was 3 people. Their lead attorney was a woman named Sandra Holt, 47 years old, who had practiced commercial property litigation for 19 years. She had a banker's box on the table and a paralegal beside her. She had not seen the notebooks before Howard filed them as exhibits. She had not known they existed. Harlan arrived with Howard at 8:50. He wore his good shirt and his work boots, polished the night before. He carried nothing. Howard carried a folder. The judge was the Honorable David Crane. He had served on the Western District bench for 21 years. He had read both filings over the weekend and obtained a copy of Carol Finch's survey opinion independently. Sandra Holt spoke for 24 minutes. She cited the 1967 recorded boundary agreement, the chain of title from the cooperative to Consolidated, the survey discrepancy between the recorded line and the fence line, and the legal principle that recorded instruments govern over physical occupation when the occupation period does not meet the threshold for adverse possession. She was thorough and composed. She did not mention the notebooks. Howard stood. He spoke for 4 minutes. He said, "The 1967 boundary agreement is built on a baseline measurement that the state surveyor has certified as irrecoverable and incorrect. It does not describe the actual boundary of the Goss property. It describes a line that has never existed on the ground. The 1951 Federal Section Survey is the controlling document. The fence line matches the 1951 survey within 2 feet, within normal tolerance for a survey of that era. Furthermore, the plaintiff's own predecessor institutions attempted to assert this same claim on 7 separate occasions between 1989 and 2011, and were told each time that the baseline was in error. We have that in writing." He set the notebooks on the table, all 11 of them. He said, "Ruth Goss wrote it down every time they came." The judge looked at the notebooks. He looked at Carol Finch's survey opinion, which he had already read. He was quiet for a moment. He looked up at Sandra Holt. He said, "Counsel, your client's 1967 boundary agreement. Can you identify the benchmark used as the baseline for that survey?" Sandra Holt looked at her notes. She looked at her paralegal. The paralegal opened the banker's box and went through it. 22 seconds passed. She said, Your Honor, we would need additional time to pull the original survey notes from the cooperative's archive. Judge Crane said, the state surveyor's opinion notes that the benchmark no longer exists and cannot be reconstructed. Are you in a position to contest that finding? She said, we would need time to retain our own survey expert. The judge said, you've had the state survey opinion for 6 weeks. He picked up the 5th notebook and read the entry Howard had bookmarked. He read it once, then he set it down. He said, I am finding for the defendant on all claims. The 1967 boundary agreement is not controlling in this matter. The 1951 Federal Section Survey is the controlling instrument. The state surveyor's opinion is incorporated into this finding. Consolidated Land Systems has no legal claim to any portion of the 400 acres described in the Goss deed. All assertions of ownership, all notices, and all demands to vacate are void and without legal basis. He looked at Harlan directly. He said, this land belongs to you. He gathered his papers and left the bench. Harlan looked straight ahead. His hands were flat on the table. Sandra Holt began putting papers back into the banker's box. She did not speak to anyone. Marcus Webb, who had sat in the gallery, walked out without looking at the front of the room. The door closed behind him. Judge Crane's written order, issued 4 days later, awarded Harlan $78,300 in damages for legal costs, lost income from the encumbered acreage during the dispute period, and associated losses. It also referred the matter to the Kentucky Attorney General's office to review Consolidated Land Systems' pattern of asserting the same defective boundary claim against multiple property owners across the state. The order used the word pattern. That was Howard's word. Ruth had proven the pattern. She had proven it 1 notebook entry at a time, across 22 years, for a reason she had written down herself. In case. Howard Birch called Harlan on the morning the written order came in. He read him the damages figure. He read him the referral language. He said, it's done, Harlan. Harlan said, all right, thank you, Howard. He hung up. He sat in the kitchen for a while. The coffee was still hot. He poured a second cup and sat at the table where Marcus Webb had set his briefcase without being invited to, and he drank it. Through the window, the south field was coming into color, the way it did every spring. First the pale green at the edges where the ground warmed earliest, then the darker green spreading inward as the weeks went on. 400 acres of it, all of it his, from the north pin to the south pin, exactly as the 1951 survey described it, and exactly as Ruth had written it down. He picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip. He set it back on the table. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post nearest the window and sat there for a moment, and then lifted off and was gone. Harlan got up, rinsed his cup in the sink, and went out to work. There is a question this story raises that I keep coming back to. Marcus Webb offered Harlan $14,000 for 23 acres of land that a state surveyor later confirmed had always belonged to him. If you had been in that kitchen, if you had not known about the notebooks, had not yet called a lawyer, had only seen the briefcase and the printouts and heard the polite explanation, would you have taken the money? Tell me in the comments. I mean it. Because I think the answer says something important about what most people do when the paperwork looks official enough. Subscribe, and I'll see you next story. Paste your script.